Well, good morning. Welcome to Windy, Ohio. Jesse Oliver is not with us this morning because all of our signs decided to pull a Dorothy and go to the Wizard of Oz or something. So we're gonna try to find those. That's where he is right now. Which is really kind of funny that today's topic is high standards and gracious forgiveness. The high standards of having great sign, the gracious forgiveness of, hey, maybe we should have checked the weather last night, and that's a good lesson to learn for the future, is if we see hurricane gust winds coming through our little village of Cedarville, we probably shouldn't put signs out. And that's what you learn. You learn that. Or with me, you learn, hey, when your back is jacked up, you don't try to get a 40-pound box of HDMI cords off the top shelf the same morning. So high standards, you want the videos to work, but gracious forgiveness, you got to forgive yourself for being dumb. Okay, so that's kind of my segue into our discussion this morning. It is a difficult one to talk about because we all believe that we should have high standards. We all want high standards for the groups that we lead. We all want high standards for even ourselves when it comes to grades. But we are very poor at giving forgiveness. And we're very poor at giving forgiveness. Let me go out on a limb and say probably even more poor forgiving ourselves when we make mistakes. I believe, and I really think that this chapter hit on that, is that these uncommon leaders, the goal of that whole thing is that you will have those high standards, but you will also have gracious forgiveness. So the idea is, we live in a world where everybody's like, you've got to give your best, you got to give your best, you got to give your best. But we live in a world where the best today in 2023 is probably what was average in 1990 and 1980. Because if you look at data, especially school system data, in the 1960s, the average grade was a C because C means average. You look at the 2020s, the average grade in school is an A because A means, hey, I'm not going to offend anybody. A means my kid is still smart even though he's really not smart. Or A means, hey, I need that participation trophy. We live in a world where we want to feel good about ourselves but still say we have high standards. And that's a danger. And I think the reason why that has gotten there is I had coaches in my life and employers in my life that had very, very high standards. And when you messed up, you got the riot act given to you. And so they weren't very gracious in their forgiveness. And I think what happened is instead of the world navigating and trying to be like, hey, let's be a little bit more forgiving, let's be a little bit more mercy driven, we became, hey, let's lower our standards, but call that high standards. And then we don't have to worry about forgiving because everybody's a winner. Everybody deserves the MVP trophy when it comes to soccer. If you've ever been to those little soccer matches with the little kids, everybody gets a trophy. I don't remember that as a kid, but that's okay. I'm old, so that's fine. So today we're going to talk about high standards and gracious forgiveness. And I think it might generate some questions, and that's great. So first of all, high standards. And this is a quote right from the book. The uncommon leaders are sticklers for excellence. Think about the people that you know that maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a teacher that you had in high school. I had a teacher in high school. Her name was Mrs. Tidball, and she would always say, be a cut above. Be a cut above. And I just remember that over and over, how we used to have to take notes in class with the date, our name, everything, and she graded us on our notes, and she just said, be a cut above. So these uncommon leaders are sticklers for excellence, demanding even more than what we think that we're even able to offer. That's high excellence. I don't think you should ever go away from that. I think when you become friends, when you become parents, when you become spouses, when you become employers or whatever, or even as an employee, you should always have a high standard that's like, man, this might be impossible. Because it's kind of fun to do the impossible. It's kind of fun to reach out and try to do something that is a little impossible. So high standards, a couple things I wrote down. They're determined by your priorities. They're usually difficult. High standards are difficult. It's not going to be like, hey, we're going to win a national championship. We're in the middle of March Madness right now. The team that's going to win is not going, oh, that'll be easy. I mean, we've already seen some higher seeds go down. You know, the whole idea is it's difficult to accomplish something grand and big. It requires kind of what we talk about all the time, that BZ culture. How are we providing that extraordinary effort at all times and striving for excellence? Also, it requires that average is a starting point, not the ending point. Think about that. The average, the expectation that somebody gives you is the starting point, not the ending point. It's the way that things that you could jump off of. And then you need to have a what's next mindset. So that's high expectations or high standards. We all have those. You all have high standards. You have high standards for the person that you'll marry. You'll have high standards for your grades. You'll have high standards for what you want to do in life, and that's great. But can I challenge you, be a stickler for those high standards, but also have what we're going to talk about, which is gracious forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't actually approving what happened. Think about that. A lot of times people think that forgiveness is like you got to forgive and forget. I don't know if that's really, really even possible. Forgiveness is not approving what happened. It's choosing to rise above it. So when you forgive somebody or you forgive yourself, you're doing something pretty awesome because you're admitting, hey, you hurt me or I made a mistake, but I'm going to go above that and keep going and still love you and still believe in yourself and keep going. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's rising above. Forgiveness doesn't remove the past, but it does expand the future. The idea that when you're able to forgive somebody or even forgive yourself, it opens up new doors. There are so many times that I'll make mistakes in the office that I'll be so down on myself that I'll miss opportunities that God has right in front of me. So it's not forgetting, it's rising above and moving on. So how do you do that? Well, you got to acknowledge mistakes. To err is human. Perfection's a myth. Failure is not final or fatal. We need to be mercy-driven individual. Mercy does not compromise the high standards. Mercy allows the leader not to compromise their humanity. Think about that. You could have high standards and compromise your humanity and seem like you're just going to run over everybody. Mercy doesn't compromise your humanity. Mercy, we all desire mercy, but we don't all give it. And mercy doesn't remove consequences. It provides a path of restoration moving forward. So forgive your mistakes. So getting into this, I have two questions I want to ask you. Why don't we do this? And what if we did this? And then we'll go over that box that he does at the end of the chapter, and then we'll get to questions. Regulations cause people to perform out of duty. So expectation, regulations cause people to perform out of duty. Leaders with high expectations or high standards and a capacity to forgive motivate people to perform out of devotion. Do we want people to perform out of this whole idea of duty, like I'm going to do my job, or out of devotion to the job? There are sometimes you do things out of duty because you're being faithful. There are things that what we want and what I want from you is I want people to follow you and I want you to follow people out of devotion to their idea, not just out of duty, because duty sometimes you can turn it off and then it really doesn't matter. So why don't leaders have high standards? Well, it requires, let me give you these four things. It requires sacrifice. When you don't do this, you don't have high standards and gracious forgiveness, it's because it requires work. It's also to forgive people means to admit that they hurt you. And we're in a world today going, just don't admit that people hurt you. Be resilient. That's our idea of resilience. That's the wrong idea of resilience. The proper definition of resilience is somebody's going to do you wrong. How are you going to stick to it even when you know that they did you wrong? So it requires sacrifice. Average is expected in our world today. It is. Hey, that's good enough. I worked at a sheet metal company in the summer of 1992. And there was a quota where you're building big doors for trucks. And there was a quota. I had to put the big sheet metal in and cut it with this big 75-ton press. I'd pull it out, put it over here. There was a quota for how many I had to do every night. And man, as a 20-some-year-old kid, I'm like, I'm going to blow that quota up. So I think the quota was like 1,000 or something in a night, and I was at 1,200 the first night, then 1,500 the next night, and then 1,300 the next night. So I was well over the quota. About 3 weeks later, I came in, I was third shift, and the second shift people came in, and they're like, you're that kid. I go, what do you mean? They're like, you're that kid that blows all of our thing out, so now we can't take our smoke breaks when we need it. They wanted the quota to be where it was so they could work. Yeah, 1,000 doors was easy. I mean, it was almost comical how easy it was. But we live in a world where it's like, man, let's just do just enough to get through. Just enough to get through. And that's what we do. So average is what is expected. Good enough is our target. I just mentioned that. We want to know what is expected, but we just want to know the expectations. I want to know what Weston expects of me at Renova so I can just meet those expectations, but no more. I want to know exactly what Jesse wants for setups so I can meet that expectation, but not go the extra mile and figure some other things out. I want to know exactly what is expected during a leave so I know exactly the dates I can give to PSG instead of maybe beating the dates for PSG and providing them that data even earlier. That's our target. So the transition between, why don't we do this to what if we did this is this. When a team member knows that their leader has high standards, yet is willing to forgive mistakes, it frees them to push themselves to take appropriate risk and to initiate when they normally would hold back and play it safe. So we live in a world, the reason why we don't push things is because we don't want to get in trouble. And I do this all the time. I don't want to rock the boat too much because if I rock the boat too much, like some decisions that had to be made this morning, if I rock the boat too much, am I going to get reprimanded by another division? Potentially. But I've got to be willing to forgive myself, forgive the team, to take the blame if I want to have high standards and gracious forgiveness. Because that's the only way that we're going to improve. We could have put the big inflatable stinger out last night. He probably would have been in Kansas this morning if he would have been out last night. Okay? But also, that's a $5,000, actually it's a $15,000 piece of equipment. It's outside in the rain and it gets ruined. So some of that is Jesse and I made the hard decision to leave it in. Now we're going to have to be willing to be gracious to other people when they come this morning and it's not where they think it should be. And we have to explain that. So you've got to work for people, or you need to be that person that has those high expectations, those high standards, but you're very willing to forgive. So what if we did this? So what if? I love the question, what if? What if average was the starting point? What if average was the starting point? You sought out expectations in your first nursing job, your first video job in Boston. You thought out all these, you get those expectations, and you're like, how do I make it just 1% better? I'm not saying you go in the nursing jobs, ladies, or gentlemen also, and just go in and go like, I'm going to change all the policies. That's not what I'm saying, but how do you make it 1% better for the patient? How do you go and do videography and make it 1% better, do something 1% better for your boss, but also for the client? What if average was the starting point? What if you identified your priorities and you knew what you were not going to compromise on? I think a lot of times people struggle with high standards because it's like, this is too much work, it's too much work, because you haven't identified that family's a priority and you haven't communicated that family's a priority, so that when you have to leave because family's a priority, your boss is looking at you like, where'd you go? But what happens if you really communicated and you identified your priorities? What if you really lived, providing extraordinary effort and striving for excellence at all time? What if? What if people saw that? Because if you're striving for excellence at all time, you're striving for those high standards, but you're also, if you're striving for excellence, you care more about the people that are sitting around the room than you do about the end goal, because you know you can't get to the end goal without the people. What if you were observant and aware? Think about that with high standards. What if you were aware of your boss's high standards, or your client's high standards, or the people you represent in Washington, D.C.'s high standards? What if you're aware of that? If you're aware of what people, their high standards they have, you're going to shoot to try to get that, But then you also need to be graciously forgiving, because at times when you don't meet people's high standards and something happens, go the extra mile to explain what you did. Even though they're not asking for forgiveness, you're providing for them the opportunity to be forgiving. So this morning, something happened again. There was a piece of equipment that we're not supposed to touch. They didn't get removed. So we could have sent the email, and our first email was, hey, get these things out of here by 8 o'clock. Or the second email, which we did, was like, hey, these things are here. They haven't been removed. We assume that you probably were not aware that they needed to be removed. Automatically, I took high standards, having the room ready, and added gracious forgiveness in by saying, hey, this might just not have been on your radar. And that when you have high standards for yourself and high standards for how to treat people and high standards for how to forgive people, you start to think that way and go, oh my goodness, what if they really didn't know? So it softens that message. The message and the high standards didn't get softened, like the tech cart's got to be moved. But the message was softened a little bit. So at the end of the book, at the end of every chapter, he has a page where he gives a couple of things. And it's on high standards and gracious forgiveness. When I have high standards, I challenge people to strive for excellence. When I have gracious forgiveness, I enable people to take risk on the way. So I want people to strive for excellence, but I also want them to take risk. I want people to try things like flying drones into the student center. When I have high standards, I enable people to perform better. When I have gracious forgiveness, I encourage people to push harder. When I have high standards, no one settles for mediocre outcomes. When I have forgiveness, no one worries about disappointing a leader. When I set high standards, people are motivated towards excellence. When I have gracious forgiveness, people are inspired because they're safe. We need to live in a world where we can create safety. One of the things that I talk about all the time is that as Christians, even when you're the leader of somebody or you're following somebody that might not live to your worldview, how are you being graciously forgiven but still having your high standards of your beliefs? You're not watering down your beliefs, but you're holding to the idea that you could still value people. I don't think we do that well as Christians. And I think Jesus did that really well. The examples of eating with tax collectors, just all the different stories of Jesus where he was with sinners but never sinned himself. He had high standards and gracious forgiveness. When I have high standards, I set targets to hit. When I offer gracious forgiveness, I offer safety nets to fall into. When I set high standards, teams do more than they felt possible. When I offer gracious forgiveness, teams do more than they felt possible. It is one of those that for me has been a gut punch in the last couple of weeks reading this chapter, is the idea that I believe that we should always have high standards, but more importantly, we should always have high standards when it comes to valuing and forgiving people. Mistakes will happen. Mistakes will happen, and it goes back to what my friend Brian White says, speak the truth in love at all times, but don't cut the truth in half and call it love. Forgiveness and mercy is not going, okay, you basically just put your fingers in the milk at Renova. That's okay. That's cool. No, forgiveness is like, hey, let me show you. Maybe let me help you figure out how to make this better so that you can learn. The goal is to always be improving. That's the end goal. And I think we start too many times with expectations, saying, oh, I just got to make coffee. No, you got to make coffee, and you got to serve guests, and you got to make people smile. You got to make people's day. You see what happened? From those expectations grew those high standards. And when you make mistakes, you hear what I said? When you make mistakes, man up, woman up, admit it, ask for forgiveness, and move on. Forgiveness is a powerful thing that you can provide to others, but I'm going to challenge you in our society today, forgiveness is something that we don't provide for ourselves. When we make mistakes, we get down on ourselves. Forgive yourself. And sometimes when you get down on yourself and you don't forgive yourself, you think that other people aren't forgiving you, so you're actually doing them wrong. So have that high standards that gracious forgiveness, so you can go out and do more than the C average, and you can also be that person that looks for the good and and values other people. So high standards, gracious forgiveness, not easy, but it will be something that will be life-changing.